Want to make seed starting extremely easy on yourself? Try winter sowing. Hey friends, it's Kendall, your joyful farmer. Winter sowing is a method created by Trudy Geissle Davidoff. She actually coined the term, and it's recognized by the U.S. Department of Agriculture. It's defined as a propagation method used throughout the winter where temperate climate seeds are sown into protective, vented containers and placed outdoors to foster a naturally timed, high percentage germination of climate-tolerant seedlings. There are lots of videos out there on winter sowing, but in this video, I want to show you the classic Trudy created method that is easy, straightforward, and has been proven to result in very strong plants. This video is a comprehensive guide. It's going to have everything you need to know to be successful with winter sowing. This will be part 1, and I'll also put a link in the description below to part 2 in this winter sowing series. In part 2, I'll share with you some of the hacks and modifications that I apply to this method, including combining soil blocking with winter sowing. If you've never winter sown before, I would highly recommend that you fully understand the classic method before you try modifying it at all. You may want to take notes in this video as we go along. There's a lot of great information. We're going to walk through containers you can use, potting soil mediums, how to choose your seeds, how to set them up and to sow them, and troubleshooting tips for the process. So why would you want to winter sow seeds? First, it is super easy to do. You set up the containers and sow them in winter, and then you can 95% forget about them until the spring. It's also cost effective. You don't need to buy a fancy grow light setup or a greenhouse or buy a lot of pricey equipment. This method is also perfect for people who lack space indoors to set up grow lights or window space indoors to start seeds successfully. And it can increase your germination rates and success. Many seeds that are notoriously difficult to sprout, like coneflower, lavender, and perennial herbs, germinate much more easily with winter sowing. It's also really nice because you don't need to constantly check on your plants that are growing under grow lights indoors, and you can skip the worrying about leggy seedlings since they're growing outdoors in the sunlight. Plus, winter sown seedlings are tougher and are actually adapted to your climate from the day that they germinate. You don't have to harden them off because they're already used to those outdoor conditions. They're ready to be planted out as soon as the weather warms up and they reach the right size, so 1 to 3 inches, or when they have 2 sets of true leaves, whichever comes first. The containers also keep the seeds safe from being washed away or eaten by critters. And of course, growing your own plants from seeds saves you a lot of money and opens up a world of options, and you can be sure that they're free from pesticides. And maybe my favorite part of winter sowing is that it's so much fun to do during the winter when you're stuck inside, it's cold outside, and you're dreaming about your spring garden. First, let's talk about containers. As long as your container can hold 3 to 4 inches of potting soil, it has holes for drainage on the bottom of it, allows for rain or snow to enter through the top with some holes, and there is headroom for the seedlings to grow, you're all set. There are lots of possibilities for containers. The top does need to be translucent enough to let light in so that the seeds will germinate and grow. I personally like repurposing containers that I already have on hand. You can go for translucent milk jugs, water jugs, juice bottles, clear or colored soda bottles, aluminum pans, salad mix boxes. I love those clear plastic salad mix containers with the lids on the top that are kind of deep. Those work really well. Plastic shoebox containers, pretzel barrels, cheese curl containers. I've seen people use ice cream buckets, and I've even seen people use comforter bags, just putting soil in the bottom of a comforter bag. You can use regular plant pots and just have plastic over the top of those. Ziploc bags even work. You can just fill them with potting soil and have them stay upright. You can even use a clear tote and put smaller cups or smaller pots inside of that, and that works really well to grow a lot of different varieties and keep them organized in there. Again, just make sure that your containers allow light in, or they're at least clear on the top. Your containers also need holes in the lid for moisture, like rain, snow, or water from a watering can to get in. You'll want to keep the caps off of milk jugs and bottles so that you have a vent at the top, but any lids and covers do need to be secured onto the container with either tape, or I've seen some people use pipe cleaners. I love these containers because they have lids that can snap shut. If your container doesn't already have a hole on the top, you will need to add holes in the lid. I just used a drill bit to drill holes into the top of my lid. You could also use a hot glue gun to melt holes in as well. And on any container, you're going to need holes in the bottom of it so that excess moisture can drain out. I like to test to see if there are enough holes in the top and bottom by using the shower setting on my watering hose to simulate rain. And of course, you'll want to label your containers with what you have planted. Labels can fade very easily out in the weather, so I use oil-based Sharpies to label the jug or container. I'll usually write the name of what I planted on top, as well as put a piece of duct tape on the bottom of the container, and I'll label it that way. And on the inside, I'll also put a plant marker and label it in there as well. I tend to over-label a little bit. Some people also just use numbers on each container, and they'll write themselves a key on a piece of paper just to make it easier for themselves. Next, let's talk about potting soil. Here are some tips on what kind of potting soil or mix you should use for winter sowing. When it comes to potting soil, pretty much any type will do. Whether you go with a traditional potting mix or a soilless option, both are designed for container gardening and they'll work just fine. However, there are some mediums that you do want to avoid. You will want to steer clear of any seed starting mix. Those mixes lack nutrients and they aren't meant to keep seedlings thriving in their containers for very long. You'd have to move your seedlings to a new pot way too early, which can quickly stunt them and stunt their growth. Plus, those mixes dry out more quickly and they are pricier since they come in smaller bags, usually just 8 or 16 quarts. Also, avoid indoor potting mixes. They're formulated for growing plants inside and they aren't suitable for winter sowing outdoors. They're also more expensive and they come in those same small bags. Moisture control potting mixes are a no-go unless you live in a really dry winter area like the American Southwest. Here in North Texas, I found that I can actually get away with moisture control potting mixes because we have sort of a semi-arid climate and our winters are pretty dry. Also, Trudy recommends that you avoid the potting soil from the dollar stores because although the bags are cheap, they contain low quality ingredients and sometimes you'll end up with mostly wood chips. And if you see a bag that says garden soil on it, don't use it. It's too heavy, it doesn't drain well, and it can bring in pests or diseases. So look for a general purpose potting mix or potting soil. Try your local garden center or farm store, hardware store, or you can even order potting mix online and have it shipped to your house now. Some potting soil mixes come with fertilizers in them, and those are totally fine for winter sowing. I actually prefer to use one with fertilizer because it saves me from having to fertilize before I move the seedlings to their garden beds. You can find these types of mixes in both regular and organic options. One option that's commonly available is Miracle-Gro potting soil, and that one works just fine. It has an NPK ratio of 0.21, 0.11, 0.16, and it works just fine. I like to use Black Gold, which has a ratio of 0.09, 0.03, 0.03, because it's a slightly more gentle fertilizer ratio, and ProMix is also a very good brand. Before you sow your seeds, be sure your potting soil mix is pre-moistened and it needs to be at least 3 inches deep in your containers. And the soil can go a long way. A 2 cubic foot sized bag will fill about 20 of the gallon-sized milk jugs. Now, what do you do with those containers? After you've sown and sealed up your containers, you're going to put them directly outside where they're going to get sunlight, rain, and snow. Of course, snow is not necessary for winter sowing at all. In North Texas, we get maybe 1 event of snowfall per year. You can place them on a table, on the ground, or against the side of a building that the container will get part to full sun. It's also good to think about heavy winds that might knock over your containers, which is super annoying, especially if the plants haven't sprouted yet and it's just tiny little seeds that you've sown in the containers. Ask me how I know. I like to group my jugs together so that they support each other. You can also put containers inside of larger totes or milk crates to help keep them upright. I've also seen people use bungee cords through the handles of milk jugs to strap them to a wall or pieces of rebar or T-posts that are in the ground. Before I go any further, if you're finding value in this content, I would love it if you would like, subscribe, or share it so that we can help others find joy in gardening as well. Next, I have a few notes on choosing your seeds and the spacing of seeds when you're winter sowing. What's great about this method is that you can use it to grow pretty much any type of plant except for tropical plants. Tropical seeds are just seeds that will not survive freezing temperatures. I especially love to winter sow plants that are native to my area, especially the ones that are going to benefit our pollinators. But any perennials, hardy annuals, or warm season annuals can be winter sown. These seeds are called temperate climate seeds. Some people choose to sprinkle an entire seed packet into a jug, and others will carefully space them out to give each baby plant a little bit more space. It works out either way. I tend to not like to overcrowd my containers too much. The general rule is that baby plants are ready to be planted out when they're 2 to 3 inches tall, or they have at least 2 sets of true leaves. So keep that in mind when you're deciding how many plants you want. It's super easy to overdo the number of seeds that you sow in containers, especially because with winter sowing, the germination rates tend to be very high. When you're looking at a seed catalog or looking online, you'll usually find some notes about how to get those seeds to germinate, or you might catch a few helpful phrases. Here are some terms that you can keep an eye out for. Needs pre-chilling, like freezing or refrigerating seeds, or stratifying them for a certain number of days or weeks. Needs stratification, will colonize, self-sows, sow outdoors in early autumn, sow outdoors in early spring while nights are still cool, sow outdoors in early spring while frost might still happen, hardy seeds, seedlings that can handle frost, can be direct sown early, or keywords like wildflower, weed, like butterfly weed, joe pye weed, jewel weed. All of these seeds tend to do well winter sown. You can also look for common names that suggest a natural habitat like prairie, desert, plains, mountain, swamp, field, etc. Also check for names that give you hints that they're from a temperate climate or origin rather than a tropical one. So names like Siberian, Alpine, Canadensis, Caucasian, Russian, etc. And consider your garden and your neighbor's gardens too. If you've noticed any plants popping up as seedlings in the spring that you didn't plant, those naturally reseed in your climate and they're going to be great options to winter sow. You can absolutely winter sow vegetables as well. Growing zones do matter, but not so much for germination. It's more about your climate and the days to maturity of the veggies. Pick your days to maturity wisely. We have a longer growing season here in North Texas, so we can really get away with growing most things. If you live in a cooler climate with a shorter growing season, you'll want to choose shorter days to maturity to ensure that you're able to harvest a ripe crop before the cold weather rolls back in. After a season of practice, you'll really get a better feel for your garden's natural rhythms and figure out what plants work best for you in your area. But germinating veggies through winter sowing can be a really fun learning experience, and it's definitely worth a try. It's getting cold out here. So let's talk about when and how you sow your seeds. Trudy, who's the creator of classic winter sowing, believes you can winter sow whenever you want with no strict schedule as long as it's during winter. This year, the first day of winter for us is December 21st. It's also called the winter solstice, and it is the shortest day of the year. It's the day with the shortest hours of daylight in the northern hemisphere for the year. Typically, on or shortly right after the winter solstice, I'll start sowing perennials since they need at least 4 to 6 weeks of a cold period known as cold stratification. Some of the perennials that I'm planning to start here in a couple of weeks are hollyhocks. I also have some lavender, different yarrows, and some sweet joe pye weed, which I saved from some plants last year. I'll also sow some poppies pretty close to the winter solstice because they really like that cold stratification as well. And shortly thereafter, I'll start to sow my more cool season hardy annuals and some biennials. So I'll sow things like my salvia, another salvia, sweet pea, calendula, more salvia, some billy buttons, and I'll also sow some veggies like some kales, and I've got some leeks and some lettuces. And then closer to the end of the winter, I'll start to winter sow my warm season annuals because those are the ones that don't need cold stratification. There are also some seeds that I've tried sowing multiple different methods, and winter sowing has actually been the magic trick for a lot of those hard to germinate seeds. So things like lavender, rosemary, agastache, which is a really nice plant to use for tea. Anyway, winter sowing works really well for a lot of those seeds that you may have had a hard time with before. When you're winter sowing, there's no need to soak or scarify your seeds because the freezing and thawing that naturally happens in that winter sowing container will break down that seed coat, and nature does that work for you. Next, let me explain a little bit more and give you a few more examples of each of the different categories of plants that you might winter sow. Perennials. These are plants that come back year after year. I love to start perennials from seed using winter sowing. In their first year, they tend to focus on root growth. In the second year, it's all about leaves and starting to flower. And then by the third year, those perennials are fully mature and ready to shine. Examples of perennials are coneflowers, daylilies, liatris, lavender, helleborus, asters, daisies, yarrow, coreopsis, catmint, baptisia, and penstemon. All of these really do benefit from that cold period that's known as cold stratification, and winter sowing will give them. So it's important to sow them earlier on in the winter. Hardy annuals are super tough. They can survive light frosts and moderate freezing without kicking the bucket. However, most of them won't last when the hot summer hits, especially here in North Texas. So some of these include calendula, cornflower or bachelor buttons, annual larkspur, bells of Ireland, and pansy. These also really benefit from cold stratification. Then there are half-hardy annuals. They can deal with cooler temps and chilly soil, but they don't like frost at all. They can withstand some cold, damp weather, but be sure to wait until the frost danger is gone before you plant them out. Examples of these include baby's breath, some of the more tender salvias, blue sage, forget-me-nots, stock, and strawflower. Tender annuals are super sensitive to cold soil. They can get easily damaged by frost. Some of these are begonia, coleus, impatiens, marigold, nasturtium, and verbena. And then when it comes to vegetables, there are also cool and warm season crops that you'll want to look for. Cool season vegetables are annuals that love the chilly weather, like lettuce, kale, beets, peas, radishes, broccoli, cauliflower, kohlrabi, and even potatoes. They thrive best when the daytime temperatures are between 60 and 75 degrees, and they can all typically survive a light frost to a freeze. Warm season crops are all about the heat. So these include tomatoes, cucumbers, melons, basil, okra, and squash. They do their best when the daytime temperatures are between 75 and 85 degrees. But no matter what you decide to plant, it's important to understand that seeds are not going to germinate until they have the right local weather conditions. If you are growing a variety of seeds, they're not going to sprout at the same time. Cool season seeds will most likely sprout first, and then your warm weather loving seeds will not germinate until the temperatures start to warm up in the spring. But even if you do have to wait, it's really fun to see them finally start to pop. Oh, my buddy's here. I wondered when he would show up. Hey, Luke. You want to come in? That's Luke. Containers do need to stay moist so that the seeds will germinate, so be ready to check them every day just so that you can get the hang of how quickly the water evaporates from them. If you're climate is very warm, or you're experiencing warm days and not a lot of rain, you're likely going to have to add water now and then for sure. If your containers don't appear to have moisture droplets on the inside of the lid, they're probably in need of moisture. You can also tell if they're in need of water because the potting soil will actually look lighter in color and it'll be lighter in weight. When you want to water gently so that you don't wash away your seeds. You can create a watering container that provides a slow trickle. Trudy likes to use a juice bottle with a sealed lid, and she'll poke holes on the top of it to simulate a gentle rain. I just carefully use the shower setting on my watering hose. You can also water by placing containers one at a time into a shallow tray or pool of water so that they soak up the moisture. It's important to note that smaller containers will also dry out more quickly, so there's a little less room for error on those. It's good to check them a little bit more often. Here in North Texas, I typically have to water them once per week or so if we're not getting any precipitation over the winter. Again, that's usually using a moisture control potting mix as well. Next, let's talk about transplanting out. With classic winter sowing, seedlings should be transplanted out when they're 2 inches and they have at least 2 sets of true leaves. You do have to keep an eye on your seedlings to check and see when they have 2 sets of true leaves. If you're not sure what true leaves means, the first set of leaves that your seedlings put out are called cotyledons, and they're not true leaves. They're often called seed leaves because they're actually part of the seed or embryo of the plant. If you want to plant out each seedling as a separate plant when it's time, you might actually want to consider giving them more space in the container when you sow them. Also, if the plant is 2 to 3 inches tall and you're not ready for the plant to be planted out, there is an alternative. You can just pot them up into larger containers, such as giving 1 4-inch pot or 1 solo cup for each plant. Trudy's favorite method of transplanting out seeds is probably the easiest way, and it's called hunk of seeds. To do this, what you'll do is you'll water your container, you'll allow the water to drain, and then you'll want to remove the top of the container and push on the bottom of it to just kind of gently remove all the seedlings and soil out at once. You can lay them on the ground and then you can separate them out. She likes to use a hori-hori knife to just cut the mats of seedlings into brownie-sized squares. I'll just break them into sections with my hands. And then you just plant those directly into the garden. It's super easy. Then you can just water them in with 1/4 strength of the fertilizer that you like to use. Where are you going, Luke? Here's some troubleshooting tips for you as well. So in many places, the weather's going to fluctuate in the winter. You're going to have some warmer days and some freezing temperatures. If you have a frost predicted, but you've got tender types that are sprouted, you can just toss a light blanket over the trays for the night and then remove it when the sun has risen and is warming up the trays again. Nobody likes to lose plants, and this is one of the parts that people can find hard to deal with when it comes to winter sowing. But Trudy says it's okay if some of the weaker seedlings get cold. Let the weak fail. The remainder grow up strong. Mother Nature can be brutal, and we hurt when some seedlings or even whole trays fail, but it gives us the healthiest and strongest to grow in our beds. You can also sow a couple of separate containers of the same type at different times, just in case you do have some loss. Some loss is not preventable at all. It can happen if you have seeds that have weak genetics, or maybe a bad batch that has poor germination, or maybe the seeds are just on the old side. Another issue you might have if your weather gets warm is containers drying out quickly in the sun. This is common with metal containers like aluminum foil trays that conduct a lot of heat. If you notice this happening, you can actually put them in a location that's got part shade, and that'll help keep them moist for longer. You can also set them in a kiddie pool with a shallow amount of water in the bottom of it if you're going on vacation for a few days and you need to make sure that they don't dry out. Another problem you might encounter is if seedlings are crowded and they start to look like the lower leaves are starting to turn yellow. If you notice this happening, they're likely competing for nutrients. So it would be a good idea to give them a 1/4 strength dose of fertilizer, then wait a week, And if you don't notice improvement or some green growth starting to boost, I would consider potting them up, either some of the seedlings or all of them, to give the roots more room to grow and thrive. Or they might be 2 inches with 2 sets of true leaves, and the leaves on the bottom are starting to turn yellow, and they're just telling you that they're ready to be planted out. An issue I have is having way too many plants with not enough growing space ready. Sometimes I procrastinate and put off the planting out. If you leave baby plants in containers too long, they will grow beyond the ideal time for transplanting, and they're likely going to weaken and struggle. So another tip is to have your garden beds ready to plant, or as an alternative, have some pots ready to pot up baby plants so that they can keep growing well. One last little trick I have to share with you is that if you are potting up or transplanting and you're trying to separate seedlings and the roots are extremely tangled, what you can do is use a bucket or a tray of water to dunk the roots and gently shake off soil and separate the roots in the water. Makes it a whole lot easier to do that. But overall, winter sowing is meant to be super easy for the grower, and germination rates are typically always good because Mother Nature is in control of the process and the seeds are responding to their forever habitat rather than being babied indoors under grow lights. And it just results in stronger plants because of it. And it's super fun to do. So I hope that information has been helpful. If it was, stay tuned for part 2, where I'll share some hacks and modifications to the classic method. Are you going to try winter sowing this year? Comment below, and also please let me know if you have any questions, and I'll do my best to answer them. I wish you joy, and I'll see you next time. Did you come visit me?